Welcome, Bradford.
Hey, man, thanks for having me. Big honor.
Thank you. Well, before we get into the films, from what I understand, movies weren't the career path that was initially carved out for you as a child.
I'm supposed to be a mortician, man. I come from generations of people who bury dead people.
120 years, is that right?
Yeah, almost 120 years. Yeah, yeah.
I'd imagine there's a visual language to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's my belief that my grandfather believed that, you know, if he couldn't if a man couldn't be dignified on his feet, he was definitely going to try to help him be dignified on his back. So, you know, funeral homes are places of aesthetic. You know, a place of design. You know, they're space conscious spaces. And so, you know, I grew up around. You know, I walked those hallways as a kid and always, you know, sort of took notice of the wallpaper. I always took notice of like the floral designs. I took notice of like all the men that put all those chairs in the funeral parlor in a, you know, specific sort of design. They were all like rows of chairs measured, precisely measured, not measured with rulers, but sort of measured with people's eyes. So they were always design conscious, sort of aesthetic conscious spaces. And so,
And in a setting where it's all meant to give dignity.
right.
Very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it was about, you know, we've had a long history of suffering on our feet and struggling to be humans, you know, south of the border. And so, you know, it's always been sort of, I think, the African-American mortician's job to bring dignity to people and celebrate, and also bring sort of the celebratory spirit to transition, to passing on. And so that's sort of what I grew up around.
Did it also affect your understanding of the aesthetics of human faces and bodies?
Oh yeah, I mean, my uncle is not just a master embalmer, but he's an incredible sculpture artist, and I've watched him reconstruct many faces. And I stood by his side many days as a young person, as a young teenager, just watching him do his work. And so it was just fascinating to watch him, you know, somebody's in their 80s and they've transitioned to that space in their life where they're a child again, and watching my uncle bring their face back into a space in a time that was more familiar and sort of more palpable for a family. So I got to watch actual structural things happen to a body and a face in real time, and it definitely had an effect on me.
Is it an emotional experience even when it's your career doing something like that, like for your uncle?
Yeah, of course, because, you know, this came later in my life. This wasn't something that I planned on doing. I really considered sort of in some way a very strange calling. And so my sort of agreement with myself is that I'll only do this if it's something that I can feel, or it's something that I can bring my own sort of personal experience, my own sort of personal meta to the table.
So what caused the break then from the family business to filmmaking?
It was time. I was 15 years old. My mom had just passed away. It was time for me to leave town, and I just wanted something different for myself. I moved to Chicago. I went to live with my father. My father was a very free-spirited person, and he sort of just opened the door to say, you know, what do you really want to do? And it was hard for me to say I wanted to be an artist in front of my grandfather, who was this very pragmatic, conservative person. It was easier to say that in front of my father because he understood it, and he sort of laid the groundwork for me to pursue that.
That's huge for a young person to be able to say that too.
Oh yeah, declare your independence. You know, after, you know, it's actually declaring your independence outside of a massive legacy. You know, local legacy at least.
So why image making over writing or directing for you?
I don't consider myself a person good with words. I never considered myself a person good with writing. I wasn't a big reader growing up. I always loved just looking at photographs. You know, I remember opening the autobiography of Malcolm X and being like, "Oh, I'm not gonna. Do I really want to read these words?" But I went right to the middle of the book where it had those sort of like beautifully curated pictures of his life, and those always seem to be more fascinating to me than the words. So it's just me pursuing something that I feel comfortable. I can convey feeling. I can convey sort of my feelings about the world we live in through images, I think, more clearly than I can with writing.
Let's get down to the work of a cinematographer. So what exactly do you do? What do you deliver to a film?
In general, basically, I'm in charge of the lighting, the camera movement,
Okay.
the sort of visual landscape for the film. I'm there to help the director design the look of the film.
So break down for us then what you mean when you say the images we see in films can reinforce racist notions in terms of how they're constructed and colored and lighted and those elements.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we have a long legacy of films that have sort of undermined people of color, and they've done it more than just one-dimensional portrayal of characters. It's also proximity of camera to character. The sort of lenses we put on a camera can also distort somebody's perspective on one's face or one's body. You know, one of our sort of major celebrated films is Birth of a Nation, and it was fascinating and a major accomplishment on many technical levels, but it also had the ability to sort of undermine people by using certain techniques, certain ways of photographing faces in terms of closeness, in terms of how close the camera was to subject. It was able to, I think at the time, especially in our history, scientists were even exploring ideas of what is sort of the sort of phenotypical, prototypical African, face, and they had all types of notions of why somebody's brow was a lot deeper than another person's brow, why somebody's lips were a lot wider than somebody else's lips. And so lenses have the ability to sort of reinforce those ideas. Some of us are doing it without knowing it, but they have the ability to be sort of anthropological in a dangerous way. And so films, I think what I've tried to do in my work is try to think about those things and be extra conscious about how questions of representation in the work, not only as a writer, not only as a director, looking at director's work, but also as a cinematographer.
How have those techniques traveled from Birth of a Nation through film? Like, what are contemporary examples where you see those techniques being used to now?
I mean, I think we're all. I think a lot of films are guilty of this. Even today, there's an interesting conversation about how we wrestle with Southeast Asian Arab Americans in our films. We have this continuous conversation with ourselves where we have to create the enemy, the villain in the film, and usually that person ends up being a person of color. And so I think we're not challenging ourselves enough to say, listen, are we reinforcing stereotypes, sort of historical stereotypes that have continued to set us back for many generations? We're actually, I believe, throwing another generation of young artists, another generation of children under the bus because we're not actually wrestling and interrogating our history. In general, Americans don't know their history in general, so we keep reinforcing these stereotypes because we're not interrogating our own history. We're actually more comfortable with sort of denial and erasure in some strange way, and so I see that happening, and it happens across the board in television and movies. I see this sort of continual reinforcement of stereotypes that we're just not wrestling with.
And in terms of cinematography, are your peers just kind of like adopting these techniques that have been passed down that end up reinforcing these racist stereotypes? And that's the problem. They're not questioning these techniques and what they're actually portraying visually.
Yeah, I think, and we're all guilty of it. And I think it's we're not questioning because we all are trying to do what's needed and what's safe. There's also a question of job security, right? So we usually do things that we're told, or we do things we sort of execute notions of good photography because we want to be hired for the next job. But we're not. Again, we're artists, and I think artists' job is sort of not only interrogate oneself internally, but sort of interrogate the craft. And I don't see that sort of explicit interrogation happening on screen. What I see is us just saying, I know if I put this lens on the camera and I shoot with this film stock, I'll shoot with this camera, I'm going to get a good image. But is good enough? And I think we actually have to sort of beat these notions down and sort of wrestle with them so that we don't begin to sort of reinforce these stereotypes.
And the question of what do we mean by good images?
Right.
For the general moviegoer, what can they look out for when you describe these techniques and these lenses? In layman's terms, for someone like me, what to look out for?
Well, I think, I think the sort of like go-to example is, we see some of these figures, some of the actors that we see in the public eye. We know their noses are not as large as they would appear if the camera is that much closer to them, or if they're using these sort of wide-angle lenses on them. And so I think that's something to look out for. It's like distortion. Is it distortion because we're trying to communicate something, or is it distortion because we are just sort of interested in exploiting the moment in a way that we're not creating conversation around why folks appear the way they do on screen, but because it just looks good. And so I think we have to be cautious about things that look good. I think we want to be more conscious of things that are saying something. And I think we just have to, again, know our history. We just have to sort of revisit who we are and what cinema has done to us. My mentor, Haile Greenman, said something to me very interesting a few months ago. He said, I hate cinema because what cinema has done to me and what it has done to us. But I'm working within cinema so that I can help sort of correct those notions. And
I spoke with the author Salman Rushdie a couple weeks ago, and one thing he said, I was kind of getting him to define art in a sense, and one thing he said was that art takes history into consideration.
It has to. It has to because history is a living thing, and art has to be a living thing. If art is not a living thing, then it just becomes it becomes a version of a sort of stagnant, stale, fascist history that we all sort of, I think we don't want to go back and revisit. I think we want to move forward. And so art is the voice of art. I think art is our real voice in the 21st century. It's always been our voice. Politics is never our cannot be our voice because I think in some ways it's failed to represent what we want from ourselves. But art, at the end of the day, is cathartic for us. It helps. It's part of our healing process. And so I think we have to hold it to high standards. And I think art, we have to hold it to high standards because it has to be that much more conscious of, let's say for in film, who we're putting in front of the camera and why we're photographing the folks in a particular way. It just has to be that much more mindful.
When did this consciousness start for you around your craft? This awareness of how techniques are being used and how you wanted to use your work as activism. When did that begin for you?
Well, I know a few weeks ago you had Ta-Nehisi on the show, and Ta-Nehisi is one of my homies from Howard, and it started at Howard, you know. And I know Ta-Nehisi talked about his love for Howard. I mean, Howard for us is like, for me, is the beginning, you know. I grew up in what I would consider a very race-conscious, race-first family, but you know, it wasn't something that you could sort of take for granted. You know, we went to Howard and we found ourselves. You know, we discovered who we were, and you know, our pedagogy is sort of around film at Howard was that consciousness is our first weapon. You know, and that it's not about just sort of representing the black face or the sort of black body in a particular way. It's about representing humanity in a particular way because film, you know, as we've talked about, is sort of historically been damaging in many ways. And how are we going to be agents or baggage carriers of sort of those damaging notions? Or are we going to sort of change and be free enough to have a conversation about how film can liberate us? And so it started at Howard. It started with a particular teaching from a particular teacher, and that person was Mr. Haile Garima, who's I think, if you look at the sort of list of cinematographers that have came out of Howard, Ernest Dickerson, Malik Said, Arthur Jaffa, and now me being part of the conversation. Thankfully, I give thanks that I'm a part of the conversation. The most common denominator was Howard. If you look at the films they photographed, they're all saying something very interesting about who we can be and what we want to be in film. And the person that sort of introduced that sort of pedagogy around filmmaking was Haile Garima.
Do you have any particular memories from his class? Any moments that stand out for you as a young Bradford Young?
They all stand out to me, you know. I just never hadn't met a man that was as equally powerful and equally strong and sort of influential in my life next to my grandfather. He was the person that taught me so much about who I am and who I could be. And you know, I lived in New York for many years, and 2 years ago I decided to move back to DC so I could be that much closer to him and get my roots, because I found myself in a situation where my career was changing, and I didn't want to go down the route where I had to go home and look him in the face and he says, "Man, what was up with that angle? Why'd you photograph her that way? You know what I mean? What was up with that lighting?" You know, I wanted to have real, and I felt like I needed some grounding. I felt like, you know, after shooting films like Selma, after shooting films like A Most Violent Year, Upon Sacrifice, I just felt like things are changing and I need to get back to the root and to be. I think I can have answers to some of these questions we're having because I'm that much closer to him and that much closer to Howard. I'm that much closer to my roots and sort of my teaching around why film is important to me.
When you get deeper in your work and your activism, it becomes so important to maintain those ties, those key connections, those key people. One of them for you, I believe, is Ava DuVernay.
Absolutely.
What's it like working with her?
Oh man, Ava is one of the most brilliant artists that I've worked with and that I hope to continue to work with. But more than anything, you know, Ava is sort of, you know, as we were at Howard, we were always wrestling with these notions of representation. Who's going to carry the baton next? Who's going to like walk through that little door that Hollywood opens every now and then and lets some black and brown folk in? You know, once you walk through the door, who's going to represent us? And so many times we saw people walk through the door and they weren't there representing us. And you know, when I look at Haile talking to Ava on the phone, after being with him for 20 years, I see a smile on his face that I haven't seen before. And I know why he's smiling that way, because Ava's there representing not just our community in a particular way, and the community's vast, right? But representing our notions around what cinema can be in a very particular strong way. And so for me, she's my hero, you know? She's my hero in film. She's my hero in sort of in the public eye because she stands strong on what she believes. And she's an artist, you know what I mean? She's not just there for the commerce. She's also there because she believes film can transform us. And so I'm honored, you know? Listen, if I didn't shoot any more films starting from today, I would feel accomplished because I was able to work with her and we were able to sort of etch history and shroud history in film, you know, when we made Selma, and we were, you know, given the opportunity to do that. But I was given the opportunity to do it with a real practitioner, a real artist in practice who really believes in the transformative value of film.
That's really interesting, that camaraderie, because as you said, it's few people that make it through that door, but to be connected intimately in that way. I want to talk about one aspect of your work with her in
Yeah.
Selma, turning the camera from a passive observer into a more active presence was something you two worked on together.
Right.
What does that look like in that film?
It just means that we can no longer afford to just be observers of our history. We actually have to be active participants of our history. And for me, what that means, just technically, is that I'm putting that camera on my shoulder. I'm standing where his cadre or what Ava would call his band of brothers and sisters would have stood. And so, just trying to create that sort of intimate relationship with our heroes and our sheroes and our prophets and the folks that we really admire who have sort of transformed our lives in direct and indirect ways, using the camera as a way of sort of breaking the boundary of those folks that seem so untouchable, so far, so distant, but actually putting another generation of young people that much closer to those people, and really trying to create that sort of intimate relationship with the camera. I think proximity is something that we can't forget. It also goes back to that idea of how close you put the lens to the subject, right? It has all types of effects, and sort of is very impactful. And so with Selma, I just wanted to walk with him. We wanted to be behind him. Ava wanted us to be behind him and walk with him in a way that a lot of us in the community weren't able to experience.
Does that come out of a conversation with a director like Ava? Like you both have this similar philosophy and you discuss how you want to affect the viewer. Does that come out of conversation?
Yeah, I think initially the conversation is, how can this film affect us personally? You know, what can we bring to the story as artists in our own right? And we just hope that because we feel like we're making films in conversation with our community, that what we're saying is not just speaking for the whole community, but it's speaking with, certain sections, certain pockets of the community that actually want to view film in a different way. We don't want to be cheapened by the experience of watching films. In our community, people show up to watch films. They stand in the audience and they feel sort of let down. They feel like films are not talking to them. And so we do believe that our audience is sophisticated. They're ready and enlightened and intelligent enough to view films that have lighting that they haven't seen before in the films that sort of come out of our community, storytelling structure in a way that we haven't that we don't necessarily always get to see in our films. And so we ultimately believe that we are children of the community, and because we're children of the community, that the films that we make will ultimately be in conversation with everyone. But it's sort of hard to harness everything we want to do, the things we want to do in a film, because we're just always trying to be in conversation with the community. We just believe that we're part of the community and it's automatically going to be that way.
What has the response been like from the industry at large? Because you work on a variety of projects, not necessarily just Selma, all white cast, some films. So what's the reaction been like from the rest of the industry to your ideas?
I think it's met with mixed response. I think, again, like I continue to say, like, Americans are still don't know their history, still wrestling with their history. So, you would expect, I think that people would expect me, this man of color that's walked through the door, that's able to shoot films with Denis Villeneuve and also able to shoot films with Andrew DeSoma or D. Reese, that I'm just sort of like the benign cameraman. But I'm also come from a community that experiences certain levels of brutality and joy every day. And so I'm not just a cameraman, I'm also a black man from America. And I think I've had the pleasure of working with artists that respect that, and they know that I'm bringing my experience, my notions of self, my notions of representation to the table and to every frame. So, those folks who don't want to work with me because they feel like I'm saying things that are problematic, or I'm having conversations that have been historically challenging for all of us to have, they're not asking me to shoot their films anyway. I think the folks that are enlightened and want to have these conversations and want me to bring my own sort of personal experience to the table, how I design those frames, how I help design images in a film, I think they're asking me because they want to
the artist, the man, the person, not just the technical.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, man.
Pleasure to have you.
Yeah, likewise, bro. Likewise.